Welcome back. It's still the breakfast in Plus TV Africa. We driving straight to our first major conversation. A guest already standing by. The Minister of State for Labor and Employment, Festus Keyamo, has said that President Muhammadu Buhari relies heavily on funds generated by the Nigeria Customs Service and the Federal Inland Revenue Service. I don't know if there are any surprises there, but the minister said his statement rather corroborated an earlier report by the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited on July 20 that it would no longer remit money to the Federation Accounts Allocation Committee for sharing to the 3 tiers of government monthly, what Nigerians affectionately call national cake. Well, the NNPC hinged a decision on its latest transition from being a public corporation to a limited liability company, adding that all monetary arrears to the committee were owed by the old corporation and not the new oil company. Keyamo made this statement at the unveiling of the Progressives Forum at the International Conference Center in Abuja on Wednesday. We have joining us this morning to provide in-depth analysis of this, Chairman of ACT Network, Mr. Segun Sopitan. Segun, good morning to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Kofi. Good morning, Mercy. Good morning,
yes,
Nigerians.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. Nigeria is known as the oil capital of Africa in some way, one of the biggest oil-producing nations in the world. And we've been known to rely on crude oil proceeds for the running of the nation and for the sharing or the baking of the national cake, which is shared every month. But should it be surprising that we are at this point where, Barrister Festus Keyamo is saying, the federal government has to rely now more on revenue it generates outside oil and gas?
Yeah, it's. I think it goes without saying that if you look at the trend, the global trend of events over the last 20 years, that perhaps in the next 20 years, any country or any economy that is still relying on oil and gas products as a source of revenue will be in very serious trouble. And if you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, looking at alternative energy sources themselves, in spite of the fact that they are oil producers, and that should tell you how dire the situation can become. So it's a good thing that the government is saying this, but it has to go beyond the rhetoric. We all know these things, we all say it. So it goes beyond the rhetoric. It has to be about the action. What exactly are we doing very deliberately in a strategic way with timelines defined to ensure that perhaps, say, in 5 years' time, our reliance on oil revenues would have been reduced to the barest minimum, if not entirely stopped, And I tell you, there's no evidence on ground that any such strategy exists.
All right, but let's look at, the consensus of budgets. In 2019, we know already the budget is a civil group that's concerned about the financial transparency of the government. And they mentioned that 3 states in Nigeria had the capacity to, to fund their recurrent expenditure without any allocation from the federal government. And these states, Lagos, Akwa Ibom State, if I'm not mistaken, and to be very sure would be Rivers State right there. Right, so what exactly are these states doing that or others cannot do? Because we're talking about salaries now. The government is saying, hey, we need to, we don't have what it takes to pay, and so we're dependent on this. So if you have some states that have the capacity to pay, to run their budget, we're talking about recurrent expenditure without the reliance on the federal government, what exactly is wrong with other states? What exactly are we not doing right?
Okay, so I think what you raised, Mercy, speaks to the very almost tired issue of restructuring and I really don't like using that expression because it's not exactly clear what it means. As has been said repeatedly, when people use those terminologies, people tend to mean different. But what is clear is that we run a society that is driven on the mentality of sharing and of rent creation. That is not going to get us anywhere. We need to reverse the current equation. So what we have now is that the country owns some resources, and those resources are managed by the federal government, even though they exist within the state. The federal government is not a state. The federal government is just a group of people that get together to administer our common resource and our common wealth. So how is it that it's the federal government that controls and determines how things are done and what happens, with all of these resources? We need to reverse this equation where we gather the proceeds of sales of these resources or exploitation of these resources to a central pot and then share. That word share has to be reversed to contribute. We must change from sharing to contribution. So if we change our mentality from a situation where we're sharing things to a situation where we're putting things together after we've taken care of ourselves, then what you find is that every state will be able to take care of their own recurring expenses, run their business as a government, and then have something left to send to the central pool, which can then be used by the federal government to run our common interests, security, external security, territorial integrity, immigration issues, and those types of things. But what we have is that you have oil, you have some mineral resources, you have things like VAT, and then all of those, the proceeds, the revenues from those things are put in one central account, and then every month we gather in Abuja, we share those things based on some formula, and everybody goes back to their bases and spends the money. And that's the problem. But as long as that arrangement exists, no government, except those that are just lucky, and I say that very, very clearly and deliberately, the state governments that are capable of paying their salaries and their recurrent expenses by themselves without federal allocation are just doing so by happenstance. Lagos State happens to have been a federal capital, and therefore a lot of commercial activity is focused there. It's a port city that receives almost everything that comes into the country. It has it's our international gateway. River State is the headquarters of oil and gas activities in Nigeria. Akwa Ibom, very similar. You take those incidental events out of the equation, and those three states will probably be exactly where the others are. So we need to reverse this mentality of sharing proceeds of our resources to a mentality where we are deliberately trying to create wealth, deliberately trying to be productive from the state level, and then take the resources that we were able to create from the state and use to run the country with a more central situation. So
what then
issue
becomes
needs to be looked at until we do that. We need to remain where we are.
I'm concerned what becomes of, the state government. And this state, you also understand that every state has a responsibility. They have, structure and administration that runs the government. So what therefore becomes of, these states now, if the federal government is dependent on the revenue that's coming from the FIRS to pay salaries, that would mean that there's no remittance, to the federation account. And when there's a remittance to the federation account, there's always a sharing among the three tiers of government. State and local government would have to take their share. So what then becomes of state government or state government and governors and local government at this point in time?
Well, look, the law is very, very clear. All revenues that are generated across the entire country from activities that are on the exclusive list will have to go to the central and then get shared when the FAC committee meetings on a monthly basis. So the implication of this NNPC situation now is that a chunk of that will be delayed, and this is my understanding. It's not that the money will no longer come. It's that it may not come on a monthly basis anymore, because before the NNPC is able to emit any money to anybody, they have to go through their own internal what corporate governance requirements. They can't just raise money. They must have gone through an audit process of some sort, declared the results, and then determine what portion of the monies that they generated represents dividends, in quotes, that will then go to the federal government. It's only then, when that money gets to the federal government, they can go to the federation account, and then you can talk about sharing. So the equation has changed significantly in that money will not come regularly anymore. So it's going to be a hit. It's going to be a significant hit on the federation account, because as it stands now, from the statistics available, we are talking of this would mean potentially up to about 40 to 50% of the money that goes into federation account being stopped. It will come eventually at some point in the future, but on a month-on-month basis, it's not going to come. So the question then becomes, you are right in asking that question. When this goes into effect, if it goes into effect, how do the states then run their affairs? Because, if you've taken a 50% hit on the federation account, and then FAC sharing formula, what's shared to the states based on FAC allocation, takes a 50% hit. A state that was getting 2 billion now begins to receive 1 billion, and they've been funding their activities for that 2 billion, their recurrent. So there's clearly going to be a problem. Ordinarily, this is a good thing. Ordinarily, it's a good thing, because it will then compel the state to look inwards. It will then compel the state to fight the federal government for control of the resources that they have within their jurisdiction, so that they can generate revenue by themselves. But that process is not something that can happen overnight. It's not something that can happen in 6 months. It's not something that will happen even in 2 years. So in the intervening period, how will they survive? So it's a good question you ask. And I think that because nature abhors a virtue, what I think will happen is that this is not going to happen. They cannot implement this thing that they're talking about. Because if they do, then, governance will simply collapse across the country. So I think they'll probably have to find some sort of doctrine of necessity, or keep the implementation of this concept in abeyance. They're saying these things, I think, to prepare the minds of Nigeria and the minds of the state governors, and the political class, that this is where we're headed. But I don't think they can implement this now.
Is this, word statement and, fear being expressed by the Minister of State for Employment, Labor and Employment, Festus Keyamo? And of course, you've rightly said that, yes, the money won't be coming on a month-on-month basis to the federal government account. But is this fear, are we overreacting, maybe being a bit sensational to this? Bearing in mind that the federal government has been feeding off the proceeds from the NLNG. In recent time, they've talked about a certain hundreds of millions of dollars that have been domiciled in a certain account from the NLNG. Some would also say, well, the federal government can get some money from somewhere, and with the hopes of paying back when the NNPC, money hits the account, the dividend or the payment or the proceeds. So in terms of, in some term, writing off those loans, or monies in advance off of that. So is this not possible? Some sort of a financial plan where things keep moving as normal, in terms of revenue allocation to government?
Possible. It's very possible. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at the current structure of federal government finances, it's a complete mess already. The federal government is already extremely over-leveraged, over-borrowed, especially when you compare its debt obligation, its present debt obligations to its present revenue profile. it's already, the federal government almost technically passed the revenues that they generate by their own analysis is short of their debt obligation, debt service obligations by as much as 30 to 40% currently. So to borrow more because there is now a gap in that already stressed revenue profile is almost impossible. I think, because who's going to borrow you that money? So they will not be able to borrow. What they will do is to do what they've been doing since, is to resort to the ways and means solution, which is for central bank to simply print money. That's what's going to happen. And then with the pendant inflationary pressure that strategy brings along with it, and all of that. So it's all looking like a complete mess. It looks as if some people simply didn't think this through when they were conceptualizing all of this. Somebody didn't have a long-term plan that would have eased us into this new scenario carefully. Everything has just been done in a very jumbled and haphazard manner, and we'll just clean up the mess as we go along. I think that most likely what's going to happen is that the CBN is going to print money. Already the CBN is overextended in that regard. They are way above the legal provisions, what the law allows the federal government to finance from the ways approach. They've already overextended on that, but they will continue to break that law because nobody is holding them to account. So I think that's it. We keep breaking the law, we keep finding a way to just solve the problems that we created by ourselves. Ultimately, yeah. We have to understand that governance cannot work like this. Governance cannot work this way.
All right. I asked about NLNG because of the news that $650 million of NLNG dividends were saved by the federal government in Sovereign Wealth Fund. But, closer look, one analyst, broke it down, and we saw that these monies have also been finding their way elsewhere. But I want to bring at this point Comrade Amechi Asunguni. He is the Deputy President of the Nigeria Labour Congress, because this also affects the workers in the country, those who rely on the federal government, particularly federal civil servants. Comrade Asunguni, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us.
Good morning, my brother. Welcome.
Thank you. All right. With news that the federal government can no longer rely on regular proceeds from the nation's oil and gas business as overseen or as done by the NNPC, now that the NNPC is a limited liability company with the federal government as a shareholder on behalf of Nigerians, do you think this will invariably have a negative impact on the workforce, at least in the federal civil service and across the states as well?
I think what is happening is, do we call it aftermath of poor management of national resources over the years? Because whether you like it, the implication will certainly grow. And that is what we are suffering now, because naturally every nation has their sources of income. And the way you hear Nigerians having breaking news from sectors inefficiency, you now know that something is deeply wrong with our fund management. The no reliance on NNPC and the issue of NNPC also being unable to survive itself, it's a shock. But we all know that the absence of refining in a country like ours from inception, we have not shown capacity that the product that we generate, we can actually refine and export that same product to neighboring countries or countries that are in demand of finished PMS. Is most unfortunate, and that is why the cost, we are paying for the cost of production of this product that are refined.
Are you there, Comrade Asunguni?
Outside the nation. So all is before Now we suffer this accumulated cost and then making it very difficult for NNPC to drive. And that is why we see the issue of a subsidy, they tell you the billions of nairas that are being. So a lot of challenges over the years. We know a day will come that certainly this shortage will fall on Nigeria. It's unfortunate, but we don't think government will ever think of reduction of workforce because the promise to still keep the refineries working is on top of the game. So any attempt to reduce workers is a complete, will not be a complete cripple on the management of those facilities. So we don't think so. We believe government is still factoring how to make these refineries work, but even until they work, how will they also keep these workers relevant? And beyond that, especially their welfare.
Well,
So we leave government to work out strategies so that we don't also preempt unnecessarily.
well, let's also bring in Sopitan, who's still with us now. Comrade Amici has mentioned, he's talked about the management that we haven't managed our resources properly. I don't know if that's the case or if it's a case of over-reliance on one source of revenue generation for us as a country. Now, in the 1960s, prior before the oil boom, and shortly after the Civil War, we were very great on agriculture. As a matter of fact, I mean, it was taught in history. That's how I get to know these things, not because I was in existence in the 60s. But what we were taught and what we actually read is that, agriculture contributed about 60% to the GDP of our country. Where did that go to? Because also shortly after the Civil War, there were plans to diversify the economy. There's several plans to restore the country, together from whatever it was. And so you had several hours. But that did not work with the diversification plan. It didn't work. Development plan, it did not work. What is really going on? Why are we so reliant on just oil for our earnings? And every other time there's a sneeze in the oil sector or the industry, then we begin to quiver and quick.
I think
So we have to.
That's what Sopitan.
Okay. So we have two problems. There are two things that you've spoken to there. There is the issue of the oil being the sole revenue source, and therefore the need to diversify. But I think that there's another issue quietly embedded in that, and it's that even that oil that we rely on, we're not getting the maximal return from what we own and what we produce. So last month, the NNPC, by their own admission, said that we're losing 400,000 barrels of oil per day to oil theft. That's by their own admission. The figures are far worse than that. So what that means is that we're losing about $20 billion in revenues per annum, and that is completely, it's crippling. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, generally speaking, and that's what you are talking about. If we're relying on just one single product for us as a source of revenue, then we're obviously shortchanging ourselves in terms of all of the other possible revenue sources that we have in this country. What's happening with our solid mineral resources, for example? Why are we unable to exploit this rich and huge deposits that we have in the country? What's happening with our human resources? Why are we unable to harness the creativity, and the sheer talent that we have from our teeming populations? 200 million is supposed to be an asset. It's a liability. Why? So right now, because we're relying so heavily on oil, we are denying ourselves the privilege of getting revenues from so many other sources, and therefore we have a shortfall in what we're supposed to be generating in revenues. So I want to say, right, that as we speak now, the federal government, the money that we, not even the federal government, the money that we generate, the revenues that we generate as the country is grossly a mere fraction of what is possible. And that is what this government needs to be speaking to. That's where our strategy needs to be targeted. How do we, for example, quadruple government revenues over the next 2 or 3 years? Because this is very possible. How do we quadruple it? You said something about agriculture contributing 60% to our GDP about 60 years ago. Today, agriculture contributes about 20%, 22% to our GDP. And what you find, generally speaking, is that for economies that are functional, for developed economies, the contribution of agriculture to GDP is directly proportional to the level of development and wealth, right? So, it's inversely proportional. The lower the contribution of agriculture is to GDP, the more prosperous a nation is. Why? Not because they're generating less from agriculture, but because they're generating more from other things. Agriculture in itself is very important because you produce food, and all of that, and then generate exports from it. But it has to be mechanized agriculture. It cannot be the sustenance agriculture that we're practicing as a country today. So the federal government needs to find a way to reduce the number of people that are involved in agriculture by mechanizing it and then unleashing those people into other productive areas to generate revenues from. So there's so much to do. We're simply underperforming as a country.
Okay.
Our federal government is underperforming as a government, and these things need to be addressed.
Thank you, Segun. Very quickly, finally, before we go, Comrade Amici Sunguni, we also have the issue of subsidies to be to grapple with. If the comrade is there and can hear me, Festus Keyamo has made clear that this is not just about the NNPC becoming a limited liability company with the federal government as a shareholder, but also about the fact that the proceeds from the sale of oil and gas, or the nation's oil and gas business, are all swallowed up by subsidy payments. And he's also, reminded all who care to listen that the federal government, he says the president plans to end subsidy payments next year. The only reason he didn't end it earlier is because he has a heart for the masses, is what Festus Keyamo says. So the subsidy is going to go. On top of that, let's quickly take your thoughts on that. Vis-a-vis the advice to President Buhari by governors to sack workers aged 50 years and levy anyone earning over 30,000 naira some more. These are all ways to try and make sure that the situation is easier. The president has not come out last time I checked to say he won't do this. So how do you think, is Labour ready to listen to some of these ideas so that the nation does not suffer? Because where is the money going to come from? Comrade.
Yes, thank you. I think by the grace of God, the issue of source of income, like my brother said, is quite different from my own perception to where we are as a nation now, because Nigeria has made money as a nation. We have seen money, even in the time of agriculture, like the Quad Nation, you generated over 60%. But that again did not even stabilize the agriculture sector. That tells you it was not properly managed. Nigerians don't have problem. Anytime you show them how to make money, they will eventually make the money, but they will steal the money. So that management of our resources remain the only thing that will put refinery to work. Then coming to this issue of subsidy, the question is, why are we paying subsidy? And why is Labour insisting that whatever you call subsidy or relief cannot be taken away when we have no hope that such product will be refined locally? Otherwise, there will be endless to high price of PMS. Because a good example, even the AGO, the diesel that they have actually earned subsidy on. How many people can afford to buy diesel now? Look at the aviation fuel. See airline now for anybody to fly now, you are paying over 90,000 for economy ticket. Why? Because federal government, the regulation is not within the nation. So I'm telling you that this very subsidy issue of billions of nairas or dollars being attributed to subsidy. It remains a waste until the picture to make these refineries work become effective. So without them putting refineries to work, the idea to remove subsidy will still bring us to square one, or rather zero. So we have a problem of
Okay.
this
Yeah,
lack
comrade,
of vision.
I'm afraid we have to go, comrade. Please, we'll have to leave it at that. Yes, but I think you've said it all. What we know is that some workers will have to go. Federal government has today said in the papers they are going to implement the Stephen Orosanye report. That's the SGF talking. And we know what the Orosanye report has to do with, which is shutting down some government ministries and agencies to make government smaller. So I think Labour will has to start planning for that. It will
Definitely, they
happen.
cannot sack any worker without engagement. You can't sack workers without engagement, and the engagement will definitely suggest better ways.
All right, thank you, sir. We have to go.
Thank
Thank you, Comrade Amechi Sunguni, Deputy President of Nigeria Labour Congress, and of course, Segun Sopitan, Chairman of ACT Network. We'll be right back with more conversations on The Breakfast this morning.